Get up! I told you to clear this area 5 minutes ago!
Physics and the Americans with Disabilities Act disagree with that order, son.
Don't son me! You stand up right now or I will drag you out of that chair myself.
If you touch this chair, you are assaulting a federal officer. Choose wisely.
Welcome back to Truth Bodycam, where the lens never lies and every lie is dismantled, frame by frame. There is an unwritten rule in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Never judge authority by the uniform, or the lack thereof. The young officer in today's file made that fatal calculation. He looked at a disabled elderly man in a weathered wheelchair and saw a nuisance, a statistic to be cleared for a VIP motorcade. He did not see the history etched into the man's scars, nor did he realize that the vagrant he was harassing had written the very rules of engagement the officer was about to violate. One mistake, one shattered career, and a masterclass in the cost of arrogance. Every mistake has a price. Let's calculate the cost.
The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the Lincoln Memorial, casting long, stretching shadows across Constitution Gardens. It was exactly 5:15 p.m. The air was thick with the humidity of the Capitol, carrying the scent of cut grass and the distant exhaust of city traffic. Near the edge of the pond, a solitary figure sat motionless. Elias Vance, 65 years old, appeared to be just another part of the scenery. He was seated in a heavy-duty battery-operated power chair that had seen better days, its black paint chipped to reveal the steel frame underneath. To the casual observer, Vance looked like a man defeated by life. His clothes were simple, a faded navy windbreaker and gray slacks, and a blanket covered his legs. But a closer look would have revealed details that did not fit the narrative of a vagrant. His boots, though old, were polished to a mirror shine. His haircut was high and tight, maintained with military precision. And his eyes were not glazed over with the apathy of the streets. They were sharp, scanning the perimeter with a practiced, rhythmic intensity. The only sound coming from his direction was the low, electric hum of his chair's motor as he adjusted his position by a fraction of an inch to get a better view of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in the distance. That silence was shattered by the heavy crunch of boots on gravel. Officer Kyle Braddock approached with the aggressive stride of a man behind schedule. Braddock was young, barely 2 years out of the academy, and he was sweating. The radio on his shoulder was chirping with frantic updates about a VIP motorcade rerouting through this sector in less than 20 minutes. His orders were absolute: clear the visual field, remove all loiterers, sanitize the area.
Officer Braddock is suffering from what we call tunnel vision, induced by administrative pressure. He isn't seeing a citizen with rights. He is seeing an obstacle to his performance review. This is the psychological state where 90% of civil rights violations begin.
Braddock stopped 3 feet from the wheelchair, his shadow falling over Vance's face. He didn't begin with a greeting. He didn't ask for a welfare check. He went straight to the command. He barked at the man to move along, stating that the park was being cleared. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he slowly rotated his left wrist, checking his watch. The watch face was worn on the inside of the wrist, a tactical habit used by riflemen to prevent glare and check the time without removing their hand from a weapon. Vance looked up, his voice calm, deep, and carrying the gravel of decades of command. He informed the officer that it was a public park, open until sunset, and sunset was still 45 minutes away. The electric whine of the wheelchair motor ceased completely as Vance released the joystick, creating a sudden heavy silence between them. Braddock's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to pushback, certainly not from someone he perceived as powerless. He stepped closer, invading Vance's personal space, a tactic known as command presence designed to intimidate. He repeated the order, louder this time, adding that Vance was loitering and creating a public disturbance. This was a fabrication, a pretext. Vance had been sitting silently.
I am not loitering. I am reflecting. And unless you can articulate a reasonable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime, this is a consensual encounter. And I do not consent to leave.
The legal precision of the sentence hit Braddock like a physical blow. A homeless man wasn't supposed to know the specific verbiage of the Fourth Amendment. Braddock blinked, his brain struggling to reconcile the visual of the cripple before him with the audio of a law professor. Instead of pausing to reassess, Braddock doubled down. His ego was now involved. He demanded identification.
This is the critical pivot point. Under Terry versus Ohio, an officer cannot demand ID just because he feels like it. He needs reasonable suspicion. By demanding ID without a crime, Braddock just shifted this from a casual conversation to an unlawful detention.
Vance sighed, a sound of disappointment rather than fear. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking. He told Braddock that he was not required to identify himself in a stop and identify jurisdiction without a valid lawful reason for the stop. He then did something that usually terrifies civilians but seemed to bore Vance. He began to memorize the officer's details. Vance's eyes flicked to the silver badge on Braddock's chest, number 4922, then to the nameplate, then to the body camera, which was blinking red. Braddock snapped. He reached for his radio, calling for backup, reporting a non-compliant subject, refusing orders and acting erratically. He used code words that painted a picture of danger where there was none. Within minutes, a patrol cruiser screeched to a halt on the nearby access road. Sergeant Miller emerged. Miller was an old-school cop, the kind who believed that supporting his subordinate was more important than following the law. He walked up, hitching his belt, looking at the scene with disdain. Miller didn't ask Vance what happened. He looked at Braddock, saw the frustration on the rookie's face, and decided to end it quickly. He turned to Vance and gave him a final warning. Identify yourself and leave, or be arrested for failure to obey a lawful order and resisting an officer. Vance looked at the sergeant, his expression hardening. He spoke softly, but clearly enough for the Bodycam microphone to pick up every syllable.
Officer, you are now piercing the veil of qualified immunity. You are manufacturing a crime to cover up an unlawful directive. I suggest you consult Title 18 before you put your hands on me.
Sergeant Miller scoffed. He nodded to Braddock. The signal was given. The time for talking was over. Braddock moved in, reaching for the arm of the wheelchair. In the mind of the police, they were just going to assist the subject out of the chair and into the cruiser. But to a man bound to that chair, touching the equipment is tantamount to touching their body. The courts have ruled repeatedly that medical devices, including wheelchairs, are extensions of a person's body. Grabbing the chair is not property manipulation, it is battery.
Braddock grabbed the control arm of the heavy electric chair and yanked it hard to the left, trying to spin Vance around to handcuff him. But the chair was heavy, weighing over 300 pounds, and the sudden violent torque didn't spin it. It tipped it. It happened in slow motion. The center of gravity shifted. The heavy lead-acid batteries in the base acted as a counterweight that went past the point of no return. The chair lurched sideways. Most men would have flailed. They would have thrown their arms out instinctively to break the fall, often resulting in broken wrists or collarbones. But Elias Vance did not flail. As the world tilted sideways, a dormant muscle memory from 30 years ago kicked in. He tucked his chin to his chest. He brought his elbows in tight to his ribs. He went limp, accepting the gravity rather than fighting it. It was a perfect paratrooper roll, a technique drilled into airborne rangers to survive hard landings. The chair crashed onto the grass with a sickening crunch of metal and plastic. Vance hit the ground shoulder first, rolling with the momentum, coming to a rest on his back, staring up at the darkening sky. He lay perfectly still. He didn't scream, he didn't moan, he just watched. A few yards away, a young woman named Sarah Chen, a law student who had been reading on a bench, had already pulled out her phone. She stood up, her hands steady, recording the entire scene.
Ah! He didn't touch you. You tipped him over. I have it all on video.
Braddock looked down at the man lying in the grass, and for a split second panic flickered in his eyes. But the adrenaline of the confrontation masked the warning signs. He yelled at Vance to stop resisting, a command that was absurd, given that Vance was lying motionless on the ground. Braddock and Miller descended on him. They grabbed Vance's arms, twisting them behind his back. The shoulder joints, stiff with age, groaned under the pressure. They slapped the steel handcuffs onto his wrists, the ratchets clicking loudly in the quiet park. Click, click, click. They dragged him up. Since his legs could not support him, he was dead weight. They had to hook their arms under his armpits and drag him toward the cruiser, his boots dragging sadly through the dirt, leaving 2 long trails in the grass. The expensive, specialized wheelchair was left overturned like roadkill, its wheels still spinning lazily in the air.
Notice the dehumanization. They separated a disabled man from his mobility, effectively taking away his legs, and then blamed him for not being able to walk to the car. This is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, which mandates reasonable accommodation during arrest.
As they stuffed him into the back of the cruiser, Vance didn't plead for mercy. He didn't ask for a doctor. He looked Sergeant Miller dead in the eye. His voice was no longer the voice of a civilian debating law. It was cold, flat, and terrifyingly calm.
Secure that chair, Sergeant. If a single wire is damaged, the bill won't come from a repair shop. It will come from the Department of Defense.
Miller slammed the door, muttering something about stolen valor and crazy drunks. He had no idea that the drunk in his back seat hadn't touched alcohol in 20 years. The cruiser pulled away, lights flashing, leaving the overturned chair behind as a silent monument to the mistake they had just made. Inside the car, Vance leaned his head back against the cage. He closed his eyes and began to count the seconds. He wasn't counting time. He was calculating the exact moment his absence would be flagged by the monitoring station at the Pentagon. The trap was set, and the officers were driving straight into it. The fluorescent lights of the precinct booking room buzzed with a headache-inducing flicker, a stark contrast to the golden sunset Officer Braddock had just left behind. It was now 6:10 p.m. Elias Vance sat in a holding cell, stripped of his belt and shoelaces, a standard procedure that felt particularly cruel given his inability to walk. While Vance sat in meditative silence, Braddock and Sergeant Miller were busy at their desks, engaging in what police jokingly call creative writing. They were drafting the incident report, filling the blank spaces with fabricated phrases like aggressive posture, slurred speech, and attempted vehicular assault to justify tipping over a cripple.
In law enforcement, this is known as testifying. Officers backtrack to create probable cause after an arrest has already been made, hoping the written record will outweigh the reality of the body cam.
Miller threw a clipboard onto the desk, looking satisfied. He walked over to the cell bars, smirking. He told Vance that it was time for his one phone call, expecting the old man to call a public defender or a bail bondsman. Vance didn't look at the list of local attorneys taped to the wall. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number that no civilian should know. He didn't dial 10 digits. He dialed exactly 4 digits. Miller frowned, confused. The phone system in the precinct was connected to the local exchange, but it also had a bridge to federal emergency channels, a bridge rarely used. Vance waited for the click, then spoke 2 sentences that changed the temperature in the room.
This is call sign Sierra 4. Tell the provost marshal that Overlord is in custody.
He hung up before Miller could ask a question. The sergeant laughed nervously, dismissing it as the ramblings of a senile man living in a fantasy world. But the fantasy was about to end, and reality was about to crash through the front doors. The processing continued. Braddock grabbed Vance's hand to roll his fingers across the glass plate of the live scan machine. This device digitizes fingerprints and runs them instantly against the NCIC database to check for warrants and criminal history. Braddock pressed Vance's thumb down, waiting for the standard green checkmark to signal a match or a no record found. The machine didn't beep, it didn't flash green. The screen froze. Then, it turned a violent flashing crimson red. A piercing alarm, unlike any tone the officers had heard before, began to wail from the computer speakers. The text on the monitor didn't show a rap sheet. It displayed a message that made the blood drain from Braddock's face. Restricted access. DOD Level 5. General staff only. Alert. Contact Provost Marshal immediately.
A Level 5 tag in the federal system acts as a digital tripwire. It means the biometric data belongs to a protected asset whose identity is classified for national security. Braddock didn't just arrest a nobody. He arrested a ghost.
Braddock stepped back, his hands shaking. He looked at Miller, stammering that the machine must be broken. But before Miller could reboot the system, the phone on the watch commander's desk began to ring. Then the fax machine started spitting out paper. Then the front doors of the precinct burst open. They didn't knock. 4 men in dark suits entered, flanked by 2 uniformed military police officers. They weren't local PD. The lead man, Agent Harrow from the Department of Homeland Security, walked straight past the front desk, ignoring the protest of the desk sergeant. He held up a badge that authorized him to take command of any federal scene. Harrow walked into the booking area, saw Vance in the cell, and turned to Braddock. He didn't yell. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of the federal government. He ordered the cell opened immediately. When Braddock fumbled with the keys, a military police officer stepped in and snatched them from his trembling hands. As the cell door swung open, Agent Harrow did something that made Sergeant Miller's knees weak. He didn't handcuff Vance. He stood at attention and snapped a sharp, crisp salute.
General Vance, we detected the unauthorized biometric scan. Secure transport is outside, sir.
Vance wheeled himself out, stopping briefly in front of Braddock. The officer looked small, pale, and incredibly young. Vance didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He simply pointed to the overturned wheelchair on the Bodycam footage playing on the supervisor's monitor.
That chair is government property, son. And so is your badge as of this moment.
The fallout was not a wave. It was a tsunami. The Department of Justice didn't just investigate, they made an example. Officer Braddock and Sergeant Miller were indicted under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 242 for deprivation of rights under color of law. The immunity they thought would protect them evaporated the moment the federal charges were filed. The city, desperate to avoid a public trial involving a 4-star general, settled the civil rights lawsuit for $4.5 million. Elias Vance didn't keep a dime. He signed the entire check over to the Disabled American Veterans Fund to buy modern mobility equipment for injured soldiers. 3 months later, the sun set over Constitution Gardens again. The park was quiet. The zero-tolerance policy had been scrapped. At the edge of the pond, a brand-new titanium-frame power chair sat parked. Elias Vance was back at his post, watching the wall. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was the guardian. He sat in the silence, listening to the wind, knowing that justice, while often slow, is sometimes as swift as a paratrooper's landing.
General Vance proved that true power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to intimidate. It just needs to wait for the arrogance of the ignorant to expose itself. Braddock thought he was kicking a man who couldn't stand up. He learned too late that some men don't need to stand to be the tallest person in the room. The file is closed, but the camera is always rolling.